Hello everyone, today we talk about the Irish Easter controversy evolving during the 7th century and having important consequences even later in time, and naturally a root with that because this difference fundamentally that existed in the between the calendars used by continental Europeans and the Irish regarding the Christian celebrations. Would this was something dating back essentially to late Roman times. So Easter is the most important Christian festival, of course, and as we know, does not fall on a fixed date. And there was maybe one day we'll have to make a video because these things are interesting. Speaking of especially different calendars, how eventually certain festivities belonging to different worlds, cultures, and the same cycles overlapped at some point, and chiefly, in late Roman times when Christianity spread, massively, and eventually with the evangelization of the rest of Europe, there were important, differences also because of the particularism that would invest the continent during after the migration year, for which all these various kingdoms essentially were separated from each other. They did at least, they had autonomous churches. Were still here. We naturally talk about the preeminence of Rome, already achieved de facto, but not formalized and still in construction, let's say. But we see naturally also a competition, certain possibilities of political interference through ecclesiastical policy about certain issues. It's still a moment of, let's say, of consolidation of Christianity within the same formally Christian lands, right? And Ireland is a good example of that because, of course, being at the northwestern fringe of Europe, having, essentially also because of the permanence of a pagan reality, a different way of different ecclesiastical organization, that impacted also Britain, and and eventually came back. We made a video last autumn. It was about the Gaelic spirituality at the roots of Christian Europe, which is definitely also a very fascinating topic. But things differed a little bit, and naturally, the center of Christianity was still the Mediterranean. Rome, as for the West, the most important cultural, even then just before religious center. Even in early medieval times, the largest city, the most, the one with more far-ranging interactions, for sure. That invested also not just Western Europe. Rome was still technically part of the Roman Empire by this time, always more autonomous, of course, but fundamentally there is not a discontinuity you can't spot, and as for other centers like Venice or, with Roman rule at some point. But this is the moment we have seen already in European history in which the Roman Church achieves this wide range connection capability, and basically rises as especially as far as the say the Italian, the Merovingian, and also the British world. There is this axis fundamentally as the, let's say, the main center of reference. Spain was doing interesting things on its own, especially before the arrival of the Arabs, because it was developing different liturgy. I mean, some also a part of these countries, but it was competing in a sense with Rome itself, with the councils of Toledo and so on. This imitation of the Constantinopolitan ecumenic councils and all these things. That's something we'll see in our way. Ireland had also this interesting, the situation for which it had not been incorporated in the Roman Empire previously. So it fundamentally had lived at its outskirts. It had contacts with it, but it had remained different land, and with different form of political and social organization, different concentration of wealth and power. And even these controversy here within the same Irish Church would give rise to, in part, to a further, centralization. I mean, it's a big word for times and places, but let's say at least towards that direction. So with Easter, that there were basically these difficulties of reconciling lunar and solar prescriptions in the calculation of the date. That essentially led to the emergence of in Ireland of different rules for determining which Sunday Easter should fall, right? And in many years, these divergences would still yield the same Sunday, but not always. And the British and Irish churches, that at this point were very close in also in substance, in forms of organization, as I was saying before, had adopted by this time an 84-year Easter cycle, and assigning Easter to the Sunday that fell between the 14th and 20th days of the relevant lunar month. So this system was apparently, because I don't think we're fully certain, but it was based on the Sulpicius Severus modification of Anatolius I. So for Sulpicius, we're talking about the beginning of the 5th century, roughly, or slightly before. And when Columbanus arrived on the continent, here is the deal with the Irish missionaries that began to, with a very rigid, very disciplinary approach to evangelization. They basically arrived from this still largely, otherwise from a political point of view, pagan background, but with a solidly organized church from their possibilities, and they began to re-Christianize certain lands in Central Europe, especially, that were formerly Christian. Pick the Merovingians that at this point are occupying most of it, or even the Longobards in northern Italy at this point, where in fact Columbanus would be. He would have been buried in Bobbio. He founded Luxeuil in France and other important centers, and he kind of has this. That's the European dimension of that Gaelic evangelization. Columbanus naturally brought with him the 84 years Easter cycle. He arrived on the continent in 591, and he found naturally that the locals had a different system, because the Frankish Church and the papacy together, and there was already a very strong link at this time. It's not just about Charlemagne creating this bond between the Franks and the papacy. Actually, these lands were very, very much in contact since a long time, since late Roman times. Like Italy and Gaul were, let's say, not excessively, tied, especially if you were talking about northern France. The south was surely, yes, southern Gaul was definitely much more historically tied to Italy than otherwise, but even to certain, for example, to the center in the south, already Cisalpine Gaul occupied by the Longobards was something on its own. So even there were different traditions, but being the main temporal power already being the Franks and the spiritual one, the papacy, there was this important link between the two. That essentially they backed each other, and they were already establishing important connections. In spite the liturgies were different from the Frankish or the Roman ritual, as for example also the Milanese one was different, and as we have seen, the British one was different. And this Frankish papal system, by the way, was based on the tables of Victorius of Aquitaine, dating to 457 AD. For the record. And the latter was specifically also an unsatisfactory adaptation of the Alexandrian 19-year cycle. It was all previous adjustments based on previous authorities and so on. And around the 30s of the 7th century, what happened is that the papacy, so the most authoritative center here, abandoned this latter system, the Victorian one, say, in favor of the Alexandrian, or so-called also Dionysiac one, which naturally, given that had been chosen by the Pope, would spread eventually everywhere with all the other churches. Now, albeit the Victorian and Alexandrian systems differed in several important ways, they generally agree on which Sunday Easter should be celebrated. Whereas, there could be problems, but at the end of the day, it was almost the same day, the same Sunday. But whereas the 84-year cycle was followed by the Britons and the Irish, well, this was instead, it yielded divergent dates, making the contrast more evident. And therefore, Columbanus immediately met with opposition, given that you couldn't really celebrate Easter a different day. That's what all the deal is basically in the calculation. And he was firm, however, not changing the Victorian system, because he judged it flawed, and naturally here we can think of the motivations of this attitude and so on. However, after his death, his major his followers in the major foundations of Luxeuil and Bobbio were forced to adopt it by the local. So we're talking about the Frankish and Longobard rule that at that point was also, especially the Franks technically were Catholic, but since the time of Clovis, but in practice we know that they were largely pagan in practice, and they also the standards of the Frankish church were dramatically low, and that's also why eventually also the British missionaries back in Carolingian times would have to make a big effort in Central Europe to uniform and standardize for the Carolingians, the local church. The Longobards were Arians still, but they were practically already Catholic in the sense that they didn't have much more than an interest or an anti-Catholic attitude to maintain, if not for internal matters of their own, not even international policy or anti-papal stance, but actually they followed pretty damn well. I mean, at this time the Byzantines were making all the worst kind of acrobacies to say heterodox acrobacies to keep satisfied the eastern provinces because of various instances based on heresies that ideological. And I must say, the West at this point was very, very orthodox, right? Even the Arians were actually always back in Rome, that was essentially saying to Constantinople, "What the hell are you doing?" Right? So this is an important aspect of ecclesiastical history, is often overlooked in early medieval times, in my opinion. But we'll talk about it on another occasion. So at the end of the day, this Irish influence regarding the Easter Sunday calculation, didn't have much a headway in the continent, in spite of the very important missionary activity of the Irish. So Pope Honorius the First, at some point realized what had been happening in Bobbio, given that the initial rule had been brought with the Irish calculation, and this woke him up about the fact that in Ireland as a whole, Easter was dated according to different criteria, right? So therefore in around 628 he wrote to the Irish on the Easter question, and apparently even threatening them with excommunication unless they had conformed to the Roman standards. Now, this caused an interesting reaction in Ireland, because the Christians of the southern half of the island came to discuss the matter in a synod, and they even sent their own informers to Rome to actually see what the situation was evolving, right? And then it was reported back to them around 632 that all the other nationes, all the other nationalities present in Rome, because Rome was full of Franks, Longobards, all the Rome has always been that kind of multi-ethnic. They had all their quarter, right? And they are represented naturally. Here you think that there were already pilgrimages to Rome, the Christian elite including up to Britain, came usually, wrote the Testament, then went to Rome and they died. That's usually the story of these edifying biographies. And it was a matter of prestige, because naturally there were lots of interests involved, a lot of international connections. The church played its important role there, so everything gravitated. Consider at this point, Rome was effectively ruled by the papacy, right? The older imperial militia there didn't quite. I mean, it was the Roman local one, but the Byzantines didn't have much of a grip on it, because the Roman nobility and the papacy had altogether their important weight in such questions. So you can imagine even the interests. I mean, even through these foreign nations that inhabited the various quarters, the various collegia, they essentially, there could be, an interaction there altogether, also for their national matters. Like, how was this relevant, for example, in the Irish-Frankish relations, right? Or in the Irish-Saxon relations. I mean, there were similar kind of things. And all this, I stress it, in a moment in which everything was a bit still hybrid, right? Paganism was not out of the way as much as, Christianity was on the fore. So it's a fascinating time and period. And the Irish had found out that their Easter essentially differed that year. It was 631. Because the information arrived later, but by a month, right? And this basically confirmed the Southern Irish willingness to adopt the Victorian system. Consider, as you know, that Ireland was fragmented, so the rest of the island did not conform till later in the century, and then to the Alexandrian system. By the way, not the Victorian one, because the papacy in the meanwhile had adopted it, so it was the most updated, which already shows you that it wasn't a matter of which one to adopt, but specifically whether to adopt it or not that made a difference, as we'll try to see now, also politically. In particular, churches belonging to the Columban, that is the Iona Federation, did not conform until 716. So this means that most of the 7th century was marked by the Eastern controversy in Ireland. There were separate synods attended by members, let's say, of the two factions were called respectively the Roman and the Irish one, who differentiated themselves based on, for example, the shape of tonsure, so basically the haircut that serves as a badge of clerical and monastic status, and other characters that would be, let's say, a visible sign of their either Roman or Irish allegiance. And we don't know but to which point, because also I think the sources are not dramatically open about this, but I mean, the two groups differed in exegetical methods and approach. So it wasn't just a formal problem, it was literally also a different way of reading the scriptures, of looking at the world, politics, reality. We don't know much though about what this contest was about. So why is the Eastern controversy important? Well, mostly for its consequences, meaning that some historiography has said, look, this is just basically something unfortunate that happened, but at the end of the day, everything ended well, right? But there were probably I think was more important and intertwined with political issues than it seems, because, for example, at the arrival of Theodorus of Tarsus in England in 669, the adherents of the Gaelic Easter found themselves labeled as heretics and schismatics, whose sacraments were denied validity. So, if you're excommunicated fundamentally, well, that's a big deal. And this is interesting because, as you know, Theodore of Tarsus' arrival in 669 in England was, essentially a reinforcement of the differences between the Anglo-Saxon and the Irish Church, because essentially the Anglo-Saxon one had been won by the time of Gregory the Great to the Roman system. The Irish basically that was the only exception, right? In the Roman system that was universal at that point everywhere in Europe, you have a diocese in a city, and that is there is a cathedral and so on, and it overlaps. Instead, in Ireland, since there were no cities, because the places had not been Romanized, and the communities were generally speaking more reactive to Christianization. The dioceses overlapped with monasteries. Were often isolated, etc., but there were also important centers rising for the Gaelic settlement standards at the time. So England for a while was influenced by the Irish system, and up to the point the Romans reasserted their influence. I mean, the papacy reasserted the Roman organization, and this naturally brought to the big deal of conflict, imaginably, as this episode of refusing the Celtic Easter calculations proves, because it led up to excommunication. From an Irish perspective, the issue was important also because it represented with the island with the problem how much it should conform with the continental practices, given that by definition that's another reality. Even in there's probably an antagonism, as we've seen with Britain, with Anglo-Saxon England specifically, that is essentially a continental reality and would be. So maybe some of you are Brexit supporters, but there is a very few to do about that. English history is a wholly European one, and there is nothing to do with that. With Ireland, you can't start. It's debatable. It's a matter of perspective. But at least there was enough conflict to say, okay, let's stress the insularity and the essential differences that exist between the two systems to, also through this controversy. That naturally was a big deal. And it means a lot in the ecclesiastical practice, because naturally it means that there can be more external interferences at a local level, right, more far-ranging ones, and this entails that basically there is a rise of the elites by some margin, and that's something that, as we've seen, Ireland had been more resistant to in a sense, just by political and social standards. So, albeit conformity on Easter was eventually achieved, as we know, in certain aspects the Irish Church did maintain its own organization, like its own, for example, maintain an autonomy in the development of its own synthesis of Irish law, and that would evolve in different organizational terms further. Also, who was the authority there? Because Ireland, even in there, was even from a secular point of view, was didn't really have a head, right? There were these kings that essentially contended the universal title, but they, political unity de facto never existed. So even in there, as we were saying about the elites, the question was even ecclesiastically wise, because Irish Christianity was being naturally founded by the same elites that were largely pagan, but of course, as always, just like it happened for the rest of Europe, they saw fit, this form of organization as a very powerful instrument to increase their central power in a sense. So, if anything, because there was a permanent, a permanence in the church structures that would allow to build upon them further. So within the same council, with all these synods, like who was really deciding that? Was the papacy? Was these local councils? And who, as we've seen, the half of the island thought something, the rest differed. So internally, that was a big deal. it may seem from one side that the Irish were mostly oriented in, finding the answer about these Eastern question and others generally in an autonomous scriptural exegesis that would be discussed in the synods, rather than adopting or reaching conclusions that would be provided by a mere authority as office holders, like the bishops or the same popes from Rome. So, however, the 84-year cycle adherents were, so the ones that were trying not to conform to the Roman system, were ready to appeal to authorities as the Roman party, as a matter of fact, to back their point. So there is not much even a difference in the form. So there doesn't seem to be a broader ideological matter, but really we can't think it was just a matter of internal competition. And authorities naturally were important already, in those wars as well as elsewhere, in the sense that they were still highly regarded for their closeness to God, holiness of life, exegetical skill, not only because of the actual force within the church. So people did care about that. In that video we made about the Gaelic roots of European Christian, the Gaelic spirituality, the roots of Christian Europe, we were observing the borderline kind of pagan mentality of these early Christian Irish. The idea that they had, especially to convince a population who still believed firmly in paganism, in magic, and in also a military essentially mindset. So as we can understand, this clash took some also forms that were apparently very few to do with the broader Christian issue per se. Surely the matter stood also, as we were saying at the beginning, the relations between the Irish and the continent. There was the general distrust towards central authority, can be spotted in Ireland in a general sense, as long as they, aside from those who could achieve, it's always like that. Authority is a matter of it's contested only by those who want to have it. Then they have it, then they say shut up, and it's always the same old story. However, the Easter controversy surely brought to a development of the same Irish Church alongside the continental hierarchical concepts and systems, right? The circles of the Irish Romani, in Latin as they were called. Those who followed the Roman party, and this can be seen, for example, in the construction of the churches of Kildare and Armagh, that would be realized along this line of ideas, and therefore bringing to the development of further structures and practices in the local church. And it's simply about this, right? And we will maybe come back on similar topics at some point, but for now we stop it here. And I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.